The Untold Abuse of Black Male Slaves by White Women. What if everything you thought you knew about white women in the antebellum South was wrong? We often hear about the horrors of slavery, but a dark and often hidden aspect that rarely gets discussed is the abuse black male slaves endured at the hands of elite white women. This isn't just a hidden corner of history. It's a complex and brutal chapter that reveals truths we might never have learned in school. Today's video will completely change the way you look at the history of slavery in America. Unveiling the antebellum era and the myth of white female passivity. To truly grasp the horror of the abuse we're about to explore, we need to rewind time to the antebellum era. This term refers to the period before the American Civil War, stretching from the late 18th century up until 1861. It was a tumultuous time, witnessing the rapid growth of a young America, a nation expanding its territory and developing its economy at breakneck speed. However, beneath that facade of prosperity lay the brutal and undeniable reality of slavery. It wasn't just an economic system, it was a social structure that shaped every aspect of life in the South. The demand for enslaved labor exploded, especially in the cotton industry. Cotton wasn't just a crop, it was the South's white gold, the driving force behind the entire regional economy. The growth of massive cotton plantations made slavery increasingly entrenched and an indispensable backbone of the Southern economy. Even more astonishing, Southern leaders didn't just accept slavery, they justified it as a positive good. They claimed that the system benefited both slaveholders and slaves, an utterly irrational, inhumane, and completely baseless assertion whose sole purpose was to maintain exploitation. This rhetoric wasn't just meant to soothe consciences. It was also to solidify this brutal system against increasing criticism from the North. When the importation of slaves from Africa was banned in 1808, a new market boomed, the domestic slave trade. This made slaves incredibly valuable as a form of living property. They were no longer just tools of labor, but became highly valuable economic assets that could reproduce, multiply, and increase their owners' wealth. The breeding of slaves was even encouraged, transforming them into a currency more valuable than gold, especially in Virginia. This shows the peak of dehumanization and commercialization of human beings during this period. For decades, history often painted a picture of white women in the South as bystanders, shielded from the harsh realities of slavery. They were frequently portrayed as weak, fragile damsels in need of protection from the darkest aspects of plantation life. But was that the only truth? Absolutely not. Historian Stephanie Jones Rogers, in her groundbreaking book They Were Her Property: White Women as Slave Owners in the American South, has powerfully challenged this traditional view. Jones Rogers argues that white women were not passive. They were active and willing participants in the institution of slavery. They didn't just passively benefit from the system, they actively used it as a means to build their own economic power and social status within a patriarchal society. A shocking fact she uncovered is nearly 40% of slaveholders in the South were white women. Think about that number. Almost half of all slave owners were women. And their power, their influence grew with every enslaved person they controlled. This figure completely changes how we view their role in this brutal system. In the antebellum South, white women were bound by numerous social and legal restrictions. They couldn't vote or hold public office, and their property often became their husbands upon marriage under the doctrine of coverture. Under this doctrine, once married, a woman's legal identity merged with her husband's, and her property belonged to him. However, there was a crucial and surprising exception. They could buy, sell, and own slaves. This was one of the few avenues through which women could accumulate and control personal property in a patriarchal society. In fact, Southern women found ways to circumvent coverture laws to maintain control over their property, including slaves, through prenuptial agreements, trusts, and wills. Owning slaves was often seen as a significant advantage for white women to secure a good marriage, as it signified wealth and status, making them attractive potential wives. This reveals that their participation in the slave economy was not just indirect, but very active and strategic. Contrary to the misconception of fragility, many white women actively engaged in the buying and selling of slaves, often from their own homes. They turned their homes into centers for human transactions, directly contributing to the growth and perpetuation of slavery. This truth completely challenges what we were once taught about white women in the antebellum period. The overlooked suffering of black male slaves at the hands of white women. When we discuss abuse in slavery, the stories of black female slaves being sexually abused by white male enslavers are well documented, albeit still heartbreaking to recount. But there's a much darker and lesser-known aspect, a truth often overlooked or deliberately concealed. The abuse black male slaves suffered at the hands of elite white women. This is a topic we need to confront directly and without avoidance. Fortunately, recent research, especially from direct interviews with formerly enslaved people, conducted during the Great Depression as part of the Federal Writers Project, is increasingly uncovering clear and undeniable evidence of this abuse. These first-hand accounts give us a more authentic and painful insight into a crucial hidden aspect of history, filling gaps in our understanding of power dynamics within slavery. Slavery was not merely a racial system, using skin color to divide people into owners and property. It was also a system that cruelly and complexly reinforced gender hierarchy. Although white women of the planter class were bound by strict social expectations of femininity, elegance, and fragility, they still held significant power within the framework of slavery. In the home and on the plantation, they had the absolute right to command, direct, and enforce discipline over slaves. This power was not merely nominal but was brutally exercised, regardless of the gender of the enslaver or the enslaved. And here's what makes it worse, a painful truth that needs to be stated. Enslaved people had no legal protection against violence or exploitation. They were not considered human beings with rights but were seen as property, just like livestock or inanimate objects. This made black men in particular especially vulnerable to the whims, cruelty, and desires of white women of the planter class. They were completely voiceless, had no chance to resist, and nowhere to seek justice. This fundamental stripping away of human rights was the foundation for every form of abuse they endured. Have you ever considered that white women played active and powerful roles in the system of slavery in the American South? How does that shift your understanding of history? White women, from infant gifts to brutal perpetrators. You might wonder how these women could become so cruel, despite expectations of fragility and femininity. The answer lies in the brutal and ingrained training they underwent from a very young age, transforming them into brutal slave owners. Historian Jones Rogers discovered that white girls were often trained to be slave owners from a very young age. This wasn't just limited to teaching them about household management or plantation operations. They were also taught how to manage and discipline slaves, and some were even allowed to administer physical punishments to them. This was a brutal form of education, normalizing violence and domination from childhood. Horrifyingly, these children were sometimes given slaves as gifts, some as young as 9 months old. Imagine an infant owning another human being, a living soul with emotions and a family. This not only shows how deeply ingrained the concept of slave ownership was in Southern society, not just as an economic system, but as an inseparable part of culture, affecting the lives and psyches of even infants from their earliest days. This is a clear testament to how slavery perpetuated itself across generations. This profoundly shaped the psychology of those children. They grew up believing that other human beings were their personal property, an object that could be abused, controlled, and used without any consequences. It was a complete dehumanization, both for the enslaved and for the enslaver children themselves. As adults, these girls carried that sense of absolute ownership and brutality into their lives. They didn't just passively inherit slaves, they actively participated in buying, selling, and managing slaves, often very cruelly. This participation wasn't just for economic gain, though that was a strong motivator. It was also a way for them to assert their power and dominance within a system built on harsh racial hierarchy. Controlling slaves became a clear expression of their personal status and power. They also created a separate market for enslaved mothers, or wet nurses. They bought or hired black women to nurse their own children, freeing themselves from childcare responsibilities, but causing heartbreaking family separations for the enslaved. Enslaved mothers were forced to be separated from their own children to nurse their owners' children, a cruel form of emotional and labor exploitation. Furthermore, many wealthy white women even operated disguised brothels, using both male and female slaves for profit. This shows their involvement in the entire system of human exploitation, extended beyond agricultural labor to the most horrific forms of physical and sexual exploitation, turning human beings into tools for financial gain. This truth exposes a dark and lesser-known aspect of white women's role in the slave economy. Sexual exploitation, a weapon of power and control. This is perhaps the most disturbing and least discussed aspect of the entire story of slavery: the sexual exploitation of black male slaves by elite white women. Unlike the commonly heard stories of sexual abuse of female slaves by male enslavers, this aspect remains a dark area in history. In her famous autobiography, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, Harriet Jacobs vividly and painfully described how some daughters of plantation owners actively chose enslaved men for sexual relations. She emphasized that those chosen were often the most vulnerable and least able to resist. This was not romance or consensual relationships. Harriet Jacobs explicitly stated that this was entirely sexual predation and could not be considered consensual. Remember, in the context of slavery, the concept of consent simply did not exist. Enslaved people had no right to refuse, no right to choose, and no right to own their own bodies. These encounters, regardless of their outward form, were sexual abuse, and in many cases, what made this tactic particularly insidious and brutal was the ability of white women to threaten to accuse enslaved men of rape or attempted rape if they refused sexual relations. This tactic was not just an empty threat, it weaponized the very system designed to protect white women: the patriarchal system, which heavily valued female honor and white male power. In this way, they manipulated white men to brutally punish black male slaves, even leading to horrific punishments, from savage beatings to death, even when the accusations were completely false. This was not just mere sexual abuse, it was also a way for white women to assert their absolute dominance over black bodies and reinforce the brutal racial hierarchy that shaped Southern society. It was a manifestation of complete power and control. The motivations behind this sexual abuse were complex and varied, not attributable to a single cause. Some cases might have stemmed from boredom or sexual frustration due to the rigid social norms white women faced, which confined them within narrow frameworks. However, another possibility, at least on a subconscious level, is that the sexual exploitation of slaves was a means to compensate for their own lack of power in other aspects of their lives within the patriarchal structure of Southern society. Think about it. Planter-class women were considered their husband's property, with limited control over their own lives and bodies. They lacked freedom, opportunities, and significant voices compared to men. Many women lived unhappily due to a lack of freedom and had to maintain a docile, perfect facade in society, while their husbands openly had affairs or raped female slaves. Knowing that mixed-race enslaved children were their husbands' offspring was a source of extreme humiliation and suffering for them, a deep wound in their marriage and personal honor. Although sexual relations between white women and enslaved men were relatively less common than male enslavers abusing female slaves, due to tight control over women's sexuality and the risk of pregnancy, they still occurred much more frequently than many realize. Contraception and abortion methods, though imperfect and dangerous, existed during that period and may have facilitated these relations occurring with less detection. Of all the lesser-known facts about slavery, which one surprised or shocked you the most? Physical violence, not just the master's whip. When we envision slavery, the image of a brutal white male enslaver wielding a whip against an enslaved person's back is deeply ingrained in our consciousness. That image is true in a horrific part of history, but it's critically important to remember that violence within this system was not limited to men. Brutality has no gender, and women were also active perpetrators. White women, despite their fragile appearance and the social limitations they faced in a patriarchal society, also actively engaged in brutal physical violence against black male slaves. Their acts of cruelty included savage beatings, lashing, and other forms of corporal punishment, no different from the brutality of men. Historian Thomas Foster, in his book Rethinking Rufus: Sexual Violations of Enslaved Men, examined how these bodily punishments were not just expressions of power but also served as sexual violence against enslaved men. He argued that these punishments were often aimed at humiliating, debilitating, and thoroughly controlling the bodies of enslaved people, not only causing physical pain but also destroying their spirit and dignity. Interviews with formerly enslaved people and their harrowing autobiographies have revealed a surprising and shocking truth. Mistresses were often crueler, more malicious, and more violent than even the masters. Their brutality sometimes stemmed from personal frustration with the limitations of their own lives, pathological jealousy, or simply a lack of restraint due to the absolute power they wielded without any oversight or consequences. When they couldn't control their own lives, they found a way to assert power through controlling and torturing human beings who were completely defenseless. And there is no more chilling and horrifying example of white female cruelty towards enslaved people than the story of Madame Marie Delphine Lalaurie in 19th century New Orleans. The tale of Madame Marie Delphine Lalaurie is a stark reminder of the depths of depravity that can exist in the human heart, especially when fueled by unchecked power and racism. Her name has become synonymous with cruelty and brutality, a clear example of the terrible extent to which slave abuse could reach. Madame Lalaurie was a prominent social figure in 19th century New Orleans, known for her wealth and extravagant lifestyle. However, behind her elegant and refined facade lay a dark secret: the systematic torture and abuse of the enslaved people she owned. The accounts of her cruelty are truly horrifying. It's important to note that these were not just rumors or exaggerations. The discovery of a secret torture chamber in her mansion, after a fire in 1834, confirmed the gruesome truth of her crimes. Rescuers found enslaved people chained and mutilated, bearing marks of prolonged and unimaginable suffering. When neighbors broke into the house after smoke billowed from the attic, they discovered a horrifying scene. Enslaved people brutally tortured, some tied to tables, others confined in cramped cages so small their bones were bent to fit. Some were dismembered, their skin peeled in spirals to resemble caterpillars, or had their bones broken and reattached like crabs. There were victims whose intestines were torn out and tied around their waists. Public outrage following the discovery of Lalaurie's torture chamber was immense, leading to a mob attack on her home and her eventual escape from New Orleans. Although she was never brought to justice for her crimes, her story is a powerful indictment of the brutality of slavery and the unchecked power held by enslavers. There were rumors that the underlying cause of this cruelty might have been the death of her family at the hands of slaves during the Haitian Revolution, leading her to develop a volcanic darkness in her soul. However, this cannot be a justification for such unacceptable brutal acts. She was accused of illegal cruelty after the death of a 12-year-old enslaved girl named Leah, who fell from the roof while trying to avoid a whipping from Lalaurie. Lalaurie was fined $300 and forced to relinquish 9 of her slaves, but later reacquired them through an intermediary relative and continued to torture them. Madame Lalaurie's story shows the horrific dark side of unchecked power and the terror of slavery. It forces us to view history more comprehensively, focusing not only on male enslavers but also on the white women who directly inflicted pain on others. Broader context and painful legacy. The abuses we've just explored were not random or isolated incidents. They were products of a system meticulously designed to maintain racial and gender dominance. Southern families actively reproduced slavery across generations. From a very young age, white children were taught how to control and treat slaves as personal property. This brutal education ingrained in their minds the concept of human ownership and the normalization of violence. Even prominent women like Martha Washington, the wife of the first President George Washington, played a significant role in expanding the enslaved population on their Mount Vernon estate. When Martha married George, she brought 84 enslaved people with her, while George only owned about 18. This shows how deeply embedded slavery was at every level of society, even among the founding families, and how women were active participants in its perpetuation and growth. Despite the doctrine of coverture, which stripped married women of property control, Southern women still found ways to circumvent the law to maintain control over property, including slaves, through prenuptial agreements, trusts, and wills. Slave ownership was often seen as an advantage for securing a good marriage, as it added economic value and social status to the woman. In complete contrast to the misconception of fragility or passivity, many white women actively participated in the buying and selling of slaves, often from their own homes. They turned their homes into centers for human transactions, not only buying and selling male and female slaves for labor, but also creating a separate market for enslaved mothers, wet nurses. They bought or hired black women to nurse their own children, freeing themselves but causing heartbreaking family separations for the enslaved, denying black women their motherhood and enslaved children their right to be with their mothers. Many wealthy white women even operated disguised brothels, using both male and female slaves for profit. This demonstrates their diverse and cruel involvement in every aspect of the slave system. Although slavery officially ended in 1865 after the Civil War, hopes for equality for black people quickly faded. Southern states enacted black codes and the convict lease system. These were new ways to maintain slavery in a different, more subtle but no less brutal form. More than 200,000 black people became victims of this system, arrested for minor offenses like vagrancy, then forced to labor for private businesses under terrible conditions, and the abuse continued just like during slavery. Even free black people in the North were kidnapped and sold back into slavery in the South. They faced immense difficulty proving their freedom because courts often rejected their papers, and laws prohibited black people from testifying against white people. To control enslaved people, enslavers used countless brutal tools. Vicious dogs were specially bred to hunt down runaway slaves known as Negro dogs, or Dogo Cubano, trained by scenting slave clothing and attacking them. Some enslavers even created slave Bibles by deliberately removing anti-slavery passages, keeping only those that seemingly normalized and justified slavery, twisting God's word to serve their cruel purposes. Enslavers also encouraged slaves to breed to increase their numbers, turning slaves into a currency more valuable than gold, especially in Virginia. This shows the peak of dehumanization of enslaved people, as they were treated as growing assets. Furthermore, a pro-slavery physician named Samuel Cartwright ludicrously claimed that enslaved people running away was due to a mental disorder called drapetomania, and laziness was caused by dysesthesia ethiopica. He asserted that enslaved people would never be happy unless they were enslaved, a blatant distortion of science to justify the brutality and injustice of slavery. These words and actions expose the extent to which society desperately sought to maintain a system that was morally and humanely wrong. The first black slave owner in America was Anthony Johnson in 1655, when the court determined he could keep John Kosor as a slave for life. Virginia officially legalized slavery in 1661. The Barbary slave trade by Ottoman pirates was also another form of slavery that included white victims. Men were enslaved, women were sold as concubines, and adolescents were forced to convert and join the military. This information places slavery in America within a broader context of global slavery history, while also showing its complexity and multifaceted nature. In your opinion, how important is it to learn about the lesser-known aspects and complexities of slavery, including its legacy, like convict leasing and human trafficking after the Civil War, for today's fight for racial equality? Exploring the abuse of black male slaves by white women is not just a history lesson. It reveals a disturbing dimension, often overlooked or deliberately suppressed in traditional narratives. By confronting this painful reality, we not only challenge simplistic narratives about slavery, but also deepen our understanding of the complex power dynamics at play, where gender, race, and status intersected in the most brutal ways. History is a mirror, and understanding these lesser-known aspects of slavery helps us realize that inequality and abuse don't just happen in a predetermined way, but are much more complex and layered. This reminds us of the importance of continuously questioning, seeking truth, and fighting for justice in all its forms, in every corner of society, today and forever. The Atlantic slave trade? What schools never told you. The transatlantic slave trade, a dark chapter in human history, spanned centuries and continents. Do you really think you know everything there is to know about it? Well, get ready, because what you're about to uncover might just make you rethink everything you thought you knew about one of humanity's greatest tragedies. The stories schools never told you. This video will delve into the horrifying scale, the complex roles of all parties involved, and the lasting legacy of this brutal system. Join us as we unveil the truth, the horrifying truth about the transatlantic slave trade. Slavery in various forms has existed throughout human history across the globe. From ancient civilizations to powerful empires, this form of human ownership has seeped into social structures. However, when we talk about the transatlantic slave trade, we are referring to an entirely different phenomenon, one that stands out not only for its unprecedented global scale, but also for the devastating, long-lasting legacy it left for centuries to come. This isn't just a simple historical chapter, it's a global tragedy, an indelible scar on the conscience of humanity. Let's look at the numbers to truly grasp the horror. From 1500 to 1880 CE, a period spanning nearly 4 centuries, an estimated 10 to 12 million Africans were forcibly transported from their homelands across the Atlantic Ocean to the Americas. This number isn't just a statistic. It represents millions of lives stolen, millions of families shattered, millions of souls crushed under the weight of brutality and lost freedom. Every single number within that count is a tragic story, a dream crushed, a hope buried. And these are just the people who survived the initial raids and were forced onto ships. The transoceanic journey, known as the Middle Passage, was a living hell. During this horrific voyage, an estimated 15% of them, equivalent to 1.5 million people, perished. They died from disease, starvation, unimaginable living conditions, violence, and utter despair. Their bodies, without a shred of mercy, were thrown into the ocean, becoming food for sharks, turning the Atlantic into a massive collective grave. But the tragedy didn't stop there. The 10 to 12 million people brought to the Americas and the 1.5 million who died at sea do not even include millions of other Africans who were killed in their homelands during raids, plundering, and brutal slave hunting wars instigated by European slavers and other African participants. Entire communities and villages were annihilated, populations severely decimated, and social structures torn apart by constant chaos and violence. The enslaved people who survived and reached the Americas were not greeted with freedom, but with a reality even more brutal than death. They were taken to slave markets where they were sold like livestock, nothing more, nothing less. Their value was determined by their health, age, and labor capacity, completely stripping them of all human dignity. And to assert their absolute ownership, cruel enslavers often branded their cheeks with hot iron, a dehumanizing act designed to turn a human being into an object, a material asset that could be traded and sold. That scar was not just etched onto their flesh, but deeply carved into their souls, a symbol of domination and self-loss. Their lives in the Americas were nothing short of a long, drawn-out string of labor and terror. They were stripped of everything: their personal identity, culture, families, and even their very souls. Their daily life was a never-ending cycle of forced labor, deprived of all basic rights. They were stripped naked, whipped mercilessly, and forced to work incredibly long hours under harsh weather conditions, often in terrible health due to malnutrition, disease, and exhaustion. One of the most shocking truths about slavery is about life expectancy. The average life expectancy of an enslaved person in the Americas was incredibly short, only about 21 to 22 years old. Imagine a person born, living in harsh conditions and having their life taken after just 2 decades of existence. This reveals the horrific level of exploitation and medical neglect they endured. And this tragedy continued for generations. Approximately 50% of enslaved infants died within their first year of life. This number reflects a system that was not only brutal to adults, but also stole the future of tiny lives before they could even experience life. This was not accidental. It was a direct consequence of a system built on cruelty and the disregard for human life. Second leg, the Middle Passage. After exchanging goods for human beings, these ships would be filled with enslaved Africans destined for the Americas and West Indies. This was the most horrific stage where millions of people endured inhumane living conditions and faced imminent death. Enslaved people were considered live cargo, packed tightly together like parcels with the sole purpose of arriving safely at their destination to be sold at a high price. Third leg. After selling all the enslaved people in the Americas and West Indies, European ships would be loaded with raw materials such as sugar, coffee, tobacco, rice, and cotton, all produced on plantations by the labor of enslaved people, to be transported back to Europe. These materials would then be processed into consumer products, generating immense profits for European factories and merchants. This system demonstrated a brutal but efficient division of labor for those who benefited. Europe provided capital, Africa provided labor, and the Americas provided land and resources. This viciously symbiotic relationship generated enormous profits for the participating European and American nations, while consolidating their economic and political power globally. The wealth of many major European and American cities today has deep roots in this slave trade system. A lesser-known but extremely important aspect of the triangular trade was the global connectivity it created. The slave trade wasn't just a closed circuit between 3 continents. It was an essential bridge between European trade with the New World and trade with Asia. For example, French ships brought cowrie shells, a major currency widely used in West Africa, and Indian textiles from Asia to Africa to exchange for enslaved people. This shows the complex and comprehensive nature of the global trade network that was built on human blood and suffering. Many nations and regions played pivotal roles in the transatlantic slave trade. The leading nations involved in this barbaric trade included Portugal, England, France, the Netherlands, Spain, the United States, and Denmark. Each nation had major seaports, powerful trading companies, and laws supporting slavery to maximize profits. The main regions in Africa heavily ravaged by slave raiding included Senegambia, Sierra Leone and the Windward Coast, the Gold Coast, the Bight of Benin, the Bight of Biafra, and West Central Africa, Congo and Angola. These areas suffered severe population decline, political instability, and centuries of social structure destruction. The coastlines of present-day nations like Togo, Benin, and Nigeria were even called the Slave Coast due to the excessive and brutal slave trade that occurred there. That name remains a permanent reminder of the painful past, a time when human lives were worth no more than a commodity. Resistance and forgotten uprisings. One of the most serious misconceptions history has propagated is the image of enslaved people as docile and submissive individuals, passively accepting their fate. However, the truth is far from it. In reality, there were countless uprisings and continuous acts of resistance against the brutal yoke of slavery. These courageous acts were not just beacons of hope in the dark night, but they also played an extremely important role in creating immense pressure, contributing to the abolition of the slave trade and ultimately slavery throughout the world. Let's delve into one of the most famous but often simplified stories of resistance: the Amistad Rebellion of 1839. This story began on the slave ship Amistad, carrying about 100 enslaved people. As the ship sailed near the coast of Cuba, an extraordinary event occurred. 53 newly abducted Africans united in a powerful rebellion, under the brilliant leadership of Joseph Cinque. They launched a daring attack, killing the ship's captain and cook. However, they spared the navigator's life with one condition: he must take them home to Sierra Leone, their homeland. Unfortunately, the navigator betrayed his promise. Instead of taking them back to Africa, he steered the ship north. 2 months later, the Amistad was intercepted by the U.S. Navy near Long Island, New York. This incident immediately became a focal point, creating significant political and legal impact on the abolitionist movement in America. It became a critical test for the American legal system regarding slavery and human freedom. In 1840, the U.S. Federal Court in Hartford, Connecticut, issued a historic ruling. The court declared that these Africans were not property. They were victims of kidnapping, and therefore they had the right to escape unlawful confinement. This was a resounding victory for the abolitionist movement, but the U.S. government did not accept it. They appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court. At the Supreme Court, a great figure emerged to defend the enslaved people, former President John Quincy Adams. With his exceptional experience and legal acumen, he fought tirelessly and achieved a glorious victory. The Supreme Court upheld the lower court's ruling, affirming the right to freedom for the Africans on the Amistad. Finally, in January 1842, 35 surviving Africans were helped to return to their homeland. The Amistad story is a powerful symbol of resilience and the struggle for freedom. However, in many stories of resistance, there's a crucial aspect often overlooked or deliberately erased: the overlooked role of women in uprisings. Scholars like Rebecca Hall have spent years researching to shed light on this truth, showing that enslaved women and female prisoners led many daring revolts on slave ships. A prominent example is the uprising on the ship the Unity in 1770, where women played a key role. Data from the Transatlantic Slave Trade Database has provided astonishing evidence. It shows that uprisings actually occurred much more frequently than expected in about 1/10 of voyages. The most remarkable finding in this data is a unique statistical difference between ships with uprisings and those without. It was the number of women on board. The data indicates that the more women on board, the higher the likelihood of an uprising. The reason behind this truth is astounding. Enslavers and sailors often held a grave misconception. They did not consider women a potential source of danger. Therefore, women were often not as tightly shackled as men, and sometimes even allowed access to areas on deck where weapons or tools could be found. This underestimation proved to be a fatal mistake for many slave traders. Many enslavers lost their lives precisely because they underestimated the strength and will to resist of these women. The inspiring and courageous acts of resistance by women contributed greatly to the fight against slavery. Yet, sadly, these stories have been overlooked or erased for centuries, not mentioned in textbooks or mainstream historical narratives. Awareness of their role is essential for a full and fair understanding of the enslaved people's struggle for freedom. Origins and role of Europe. To better understand how the tragedy of the transatlantic slave trade exploded and shaped history, we need to go back to the early 16th century, when European powers began to set foot and establish colonies in the New World. In the early 1500s, Portugal and Spain, two pioneering empires in the age of exploration, led the conquest and colonization of the Americas. Their goal was clear: to exploit abundant natural resources, especially gold, silver, and valuable agricultural products. Initially, to meet the enormous labor demands on newly established plantations and mines, these conquerors forced indigenous Americans into slavery. However, their plan quickly encountered a major obstacle. Diseases from Europe, to which the indigenous people had no immunity, swept through communities, causing mass deaths. In addition, the Europeans' brutal conquest violence also significantly contributed to the decline of the enslaved indigenous population. The result was a severe labor shortage that emerged, threatening the immense profits that the colonies promised. This was when Europeans, with their insatiable desire for wealth and power, turned to Africa to seek a new labor source, one that seemed inexhaustible and more sustainable. Initially, Spain even made moves to restrict the direct transportation of African enslaved people to its colonies. The stated reason was their fear that these Africans, considered savage, would corrupt established European society. This sounds ironic, as it was the Europeans themselves who were committing some of the most barbaric acts in history. However, all moral or social barriers quickly collapsed when economic reasons prevailed. The demand for cheap, resilient labor to work in the sugar, tobacco, and cotton industries became the top priority. In 1518, a groundbreaking decision was made. King Charles V of Spain officially granted a license for the transportation of 4,000 enslaved people directly from Africa to Spanish colonies. This was a horrific milestone, marking the beginning of a new era in the slave trade, and it led to the uncontrollable explosion of the transatlantic slave trade. This decision opened the door to a massive labor market where human beings were turned into commodities, and profit was prioritized above all else. European slave traders, with the complicity of political and military powers, quickly established a complex network to gather and transport enslaved people. They assembled and imprisoned those captured at stronghold forts built along the African coast, before forcing them onto terrifying ships to be taken to the Americas. These forts, now chilling historical relics, once held millions of souls, witnessing countless pains and despair before they were forced onto the fateful ships. To better understand how the transatlantic slave trade system operated, we need to learn about the triangular trade system. This was a three-legged economic model forming a brutal, yet extremely economically efficient cycle for European powers. First leg. European ships departed from their ports, laden with goods such as weapons, textiles, and alcohol. These goods, though seemingly harmless, were in fact deadly tools used to exchange for enslaved people in Africa. Weapons, especially guns, shifted the balance of power among African tribes, fueling wars and the capture of prisoners, thereby creating a plentiful supply of enslaved people. Textiles and alcohol also played a significant role in satisfying consumption demands and weakening social structures. The complex role of Africans. When discussing the transatlantic slave trade, a difficult but necessary truth to confront is that Africans also participated in the slave trade. This is an aspect often overlooked or downplayed in history, but it's crucial for a comprehensive understanding. Often, it was stronger African groups who captured and sold other African groups to European traders. The purpose of this was to exchange for valuable goods or weapons, especially firearms, from the Europeans. The acquisition of more modern weapons significantly altered the balance of power in the region, fueling widespread conflict and instability in African societies. Intertribal wars became more frequent and brutal, with the main objective of capturing prisoners to sell as enslaved people. Those sold into slavery were often individuals from ethnic groups different from their captors. This means there was no clear distinction between capturing traditional enemies or simply neighboring villagers, who could be neighbors, friends, or even relatives of the traders. In some cases, criminals or those considered undesirable within a community were also sold into slavery as a form of punishment or removal. Scholar Pernilla Ibsen, in her book Daughters of the Trade, offered profound insight into this complexity on the Gold Coast, modern-day Ghana. She revealed that Africans also participated in the slave trade through a unique form: interracial marriages, known as kasari. These marriages between African women and European traders created strong political and economic ties, facilitating the slave trade network. These women often played crucial intermediary roles, helping to bridge the two cultures and enable smooth commercial operations. It's important to understand that slavery in Africa before the arrival of Europeans was often very different in nature from transatlantic chattel slavery. In Africa, enslaved people could be integrated into their owner's family. They could buy land, own their own homes, and even advance in the military or other social structures. More importantly, this form of slavery was often not hereditary, meaning the children of enslaved people were not necessarily born into slavery. It was much more flexible and less dehumanizing than the form of slavery imposed by Europeans. However, as the demand for enslaved people from Europe rapidly increased, the nature of slavery in Africa also changed. The Portuguese, seeking large supplies, began pushing deeper into the African interior to abduct people, distorting traditional social and economic structures. Another noteworthy aspect is the understanding of the African elite regarding the fate of those sold. Initially, many Africans may not have fully known the exact conditions and brutality of the transatlantic slave trade. They might have imagined it similar to traditional African forms of slavery, where the fate of enslaved people could improve. However, the elite of the Kingdom of Dahomey, a powerful entity in West Africa, may have been very well aware of the brutal fate of those sold. Their diplomats traveled to Brazil and Portugal, witnessing firsthand what was happening, and some even experienced life as enslaved people in the Americas before finding ways to return home. This understanding further compounds the tragedy of their complex role. The Kingdom of Dahomey went so far as to declare that they only opposed the enslavement of Dahomey people. Anyone who did so would be executed. This shows a terrifying distinction in their perception of human rights and national interest. On the Gold Coast, the elite even took actions demonstrating deeper involvement. They sent their children to learn about the slave trade from the Europeans themselves, living in trade forts and even sailing with them. Some families even sent their children to Europe and the Americas for education, showing an astonishing level of cultural and economic exchange, even if it was built upon exploitation. However, while the elite might have had a deeper understanding, a terrifying rumor spread widely among African communities, especially those unaware of the true purpose of the transatlantic slave trade. They believed that Europeans were cannibals, a belief stemming from fear and lack of information about the fate of those who were taken away and never returned. This illustrates the information chaos and utter horror that African people faced. History also records the heartfelt pleas of African leaders. In a deeply moving letter, Afonso I Manicongo, a king of the Kingdom of Congo, begged King João III of Portugal to stop sending goods, especially weapons, that were fueling intertribal wars and the abduction of his people. Instead, he wished for the Portuguese king to send more missionaries to bring peace and enlightenment. Afonso wrote about the widespread abductions, stating that it had left his country completely devastated. This letter is clear evidence that not all Africans condoned the slave trade, and there were strong dissenting voices from indigenous leaders themselves. What do you find most shocking about the role of Africans in the slave trade? Is it the fact that Africans themselves participated in selling their fellow people, or the desperate efforts of some leaders to stop this catastrophe? Slave life and dehumanization. After being captured in their African homelands and imprisoned in coastal forts, abducted Africans faced the utmost horror, the Middle Passage. This was not just a sea voyage. It was a journey into an earthly hell, lasting from 3 to 6 months, an agonizingly long period of suffering and death. Even the sailors on these ships were not immune to risk. The mortality rate for sailors also reached 20%, showing the harshness and danger of the voyage, not just for the enslaved, but also for those involved in this brutal system. Conditions on slave ships were completely inhumane. Enslaved people were crammed below deck in cramped, damp, dark, and suffocating spaces, rarely getting a chance to go out on deck for fresh air or sunlight. Imagine the suffocating crowding. An adult man was only allotted a space of just 6 feet, about 1.8 meters in length, and 1 foot 4 inches, about 40 centimeters, in width. Women received 5 feet, 1.5 meters, by 1 foot 4 inches, 40 centimeters, and girls even less, 4 feet 6 inches, 1.37 meters, by 1 foot, 30 centimeters. They lay packed shoulder to shoulder in scorching heat, in a stuffy space, reeking of filth, human waste, sweat, blood, and disease. The stench was so pungent it could be detected from afar, signaling the presence of these death ships. Hunger and thirst were their inevitable companions. Enslaved people were only given 24 ounces of water per day, equivalent to 2 12-ounce soda cans today, an insufficient amount of water to sustain life in high temperatures and unsanitary conditions. Their main food was horse beans and rice, minimal, severely malnourished rations, insufficient to provide energy for their exhausted bodies. They were chained hand and foot, sometimes chained to each other, packed tightly on the various decks, unable to move or turn comfortably. This not only caused physical pain but was also a form of psychological control, stripping away all personal freedom. The journey also faced uncontrolled disease outbreaks, pirate attacks, and constant physical, sexual, and psychological abuse from traders and sailors. The screams, the sound of whips, the groans of the sick, and the gasps of the dying mingled together, creating a horrifying symphony of suffering. An estimated 15 to 25% of enslaved Africans died during this fateful journey. Each death is damning evidence of humanity's boundless brutality. After hearing about the horrifying conditions on slave ships, what haunts you the most? Is it the extreme dehumanization or history's silence about that suffering? Upon reaching the Americas, a common misconception often arises that enslaved Africans were merely unskilled laborers, people who could only do heavy manual work. However, the truth is entirely the opposite. They were highly skilled tailors, carpenters, blacksmiths, builders, cooks, and many other professionals. They brought their traditional knowledge and skills from Africa, contributing to building the economy and infrastructure of the New World. Work on plantations, where most enslaved people were forced to toil, was neither simple nor easy. On the contrary, it was extremely difficult and required meticulousness, patience, and extraordinary endurance. Think of cultivating sugarcane, cotton, tobacco, crops that demanded continuous care from planting, weeding, and harvesting to processing. Especially when harvesting sugarcane, an incredibly arduous and dangerous job, enslaved people could be forced to work continuously for 48 hours without sleep, in sweltering heat and under the brutal supervision of overseers. They were compelled to work 10 months a year from dawn until dusk, with almost no time for rest or recovery. Beyond all physical suffering was mental dehumanization. The transatlantic slave trade was not merely a form of forced labor, it was chattel slavery. This meant that enslaved people were considered personal property, no different from livestock or objects, and had absolutely no human rights whatsoever. They had no right to legal marriage, no right to own property, no right to education, no right to freedom of movement. Their lives were entirely in the hands of their enslavers, who held the power of life and death over them. One of the darkest aspects of this dehumanization was the frequent sexual abuse of enslaved women by enslavers. This was not just for personal gratification, but also to force them to reproduce, thereby increasing profits through producing more enslaved people. The consequence of this barbaric behavior is a shocking genetic truth. Approximately 16.7% of African Americans' ancestry today can be traced back to Europe, clear evidence of centuries of sexual abuse and forced miscegenation. Even enslaved people fortunate enough to work in the house, whose lives seemed less physically demanding, were not spared from brutality. They endured constant physical and psychological violence from both the master and his wife. These forms of violence could include beatings, insults, threats, or sophisticated punishments aimed at breaking their will. Their lives were a perpetual state of fear and tension, devoid of safety or compassion. Legacy and the reparations debate. The transatlantic slave trade is not just a dark chapter in history, it's a disaster that has left a profound and lasting legacy, extending to this very day. One of the most horrific aspects of this legacy is the mass death and untold loss of life. Over 1 million people died during transport to the New World, and this number is just the tip of the iceberg regarding the total lives stolen. Canadian scholar Adam Jones did not hesitate to call the deaths of millions of Africans during this period a genocide. He described it as one of the worst catastrophes in human history, and argued that this killing and destruction was intentional, an inseparable part of a system designed to maximize profits with no regard for human life. However, there's another perspective from scholar Saidiya Hartman. She argues that the deaths of enslaved people, though tragic, were incidental to profit and served the development of capitalism. According to Hartman, death was not the primary goal of the system, but a direct and inevitable consequence of turning human beings into commodities, where the value of a life was determined by its labor capacity and the economic benefit it brought. Whether intentional or incidental to profit, its brutal nature remains unchanged. The legacy of slavery is particularly deep and complex in the United States. Slavery was not just a part of American history, it was the economic foundation of America. The massive plantations in the South, with their enormous output of cotton, tobacco, and sugarcane, relied entirely on enslaved labor. But it wasn't just the South. Even northern states, with their shipbuilding, finance, and processing industries, were heavily dependent on enslaved labor through funding, transporting, and processing plantation products. The initial wealth and development of the United States were built on this inhumane exploitation. Even after the Civil War and the abolition of slavery, this legacy continued to haunt America. During Reconstruction, and especially under Jim Crow laws, dangerous stereotypes about black people emerged and were perpetuated with the clear purpose of maintaining white supremacy. Systems of racial segregation, violence, and disenfranchisement continued to hinder the progress of African Americans for generations. Today, many argue that slavery has taken on a modern form: mass incarceration. The United States currently has the highest incarceration rate in the world, and alarmingly, black people are disproportionately represented in the justice system. Their labor in prisons is often used to produce goods and services, raising concerns about the continuation of legalized exploitation of labor. In light of these heavy legacies, there have been memorialization efforts and fervent debates about reparations globally. In 1998, UNESCO designated August 23rd as the International Day for the Remembrance of the Slave Trade and its Abolition, a day for the world to remember the victims and historical lessons. In 2001, at the World Conference Against Racism in Durban, South Africa, African nations made a strong demand. They requested a clear apology from the former slave-trading nations. However, major powers like England, Portugal, Spain, the Netherlands, and the United States opposed issuing an official apology. The main reason for this opposition was reportedly concern about the massive financial reparations that might accompany such an apology. Nevertheless, memorialization efforts continue. Since 2009, the United Nations has worked to create a UN memorial to the victims of slavery at its headquarters, to commemorate the victims of the slave trade. Some countries have shown a willingness to confront their past. Brazil has apologized for its role in the slave trade, and the presidents of Ghana and Benin have also apologized for their nations' roles, demonstrating responsibility and remorse. In the United States, the debate over reparations remains heated. The reparations movement in the U.S. primarily focuses on descendants of enslaved people in America who bear the legacy of a brutal system. In 2009, the U.S. House and Senate passed a resolution apologizing for slavery, but this resolution also explicitly stated that it does not authorize, support, or serve as a settlement of any claim against the United States. President Obama at the time did not sign this resolution into law, stating that it could cause too much white resentment, reflecting the deep divisions in American society on this issue. Despite this, some organizations and individuals in the U.S. have begun to take concrete actions towards reparations. Georgetown University offered preferential admission to descendants of the 272 enslaved people they sold in 1838 to pay off debts. Brown University acknowledged its ties to the slave trade and planned commemoration and education to confront its past. Even the financial corporation J.P. Morgan Chase apologized and established a scholarship fund for black students in Louisiana, acknowledging the profits the institution gained from slavery. For a fuller and fairer understanding of this legacy, an important proposal has been made: the establishment of a Truth Commission on the transatlantic slave trade. This commission would be tasked with unifying a consensual narrative about the scale, participants, beneficiaries, and sufferers of this trade. The commission should include scholars from Africa, Arab nations, and the West to ensure a multidimensional and fair perspective. Finally, another thought-provoking aspect related to the legacy is the issue of foreign aid to Africa. In the 50 years prior to 2009, aid amounted to over $1 trillion, a colossal sum. However, sadly, most of this money was misused or stolen, reducing its effectiveness in helping the continent overcome the difficulties that still linger from the past. In your opinion, what responsibility do we have in remembering and learning from historical tragedies like the transatlantic slave trade? What can we do to ensure such horrific mistakes never happen again? Thank you for watching. If you found this information helpful and important, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this content to spread these historical stories to more people, contributing to a fuller and fairer understanding of the past. See you in our next video.